Hello and welcome to our Holy Week teaching series. My name is Don Fraze, and on behalf of Forest Grove Community Church, it's my privilege to welcome you, introduce this series, and introduce our lineup of speakers. This week before Easter, called Holy Week, is also known as Passion Week. So why passion? Well, in context, passion literally means to suffer. So this is the week where followers of Jesus around the world and through history remember Jesus' journey to the cross, his journey where he laid down his life to demonstrate God's love and God's forgiveness for us. So we here at Forest Grove Community Church, during our Sunday morning services, are in a series through the Gospel of Matthew called Kingdom Culture. So these 5 videos that you will see this week will cover the passion narrative of Jesus, that specific time period, from Matthew's chapter 26 and 27. So I'm very excited that 5 gifted leaders from our congregation have been willing to share their hearts and be speakers for this week. So they are Ralph Gliege, now retired but always a pastor, Gil Clausen, lifetime youth worker and currently camp director, Jodi, Enns, our children's ministry pastor, Spencer Meisner, our communications director, and Karen Block, career missionary and spiritual director. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for viewing. I pray that this series will encourage you and challenge you as together we journey to the cross.
You may have heard it said that to fail is to try, or that the greater the failure, the greater the lesson. Or maybe even that in order to succeed, we need to fail. Now, we may know these quotes or know that this is a reality, but living out failure in practice is often a lot harder to do. Matthew shares an account of Peter's failure. In chapter 26, Jesus is brought before the high priest, and Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples and friends, finds himself denying even knowing Jesus 3 times. After following Jesus and being such a dedicated disciple and friend of his, I can't imagine the shame and the guilt that Peter must have felt after denying Jesus. But what I want us to look at for Peter, instead of focusing so much on his failure, I want us to take a look back at Peter's experiences with Jesus and maybe look at his failure in a different way. Rather than seeing it for what it is, maybe seeing it as a way that Peter is showing up and he's failing, trying, and he's leaning in. So looking back at John chapter 13, this isn't so much of an account of his failure, but what we see is the posture that Peter has towards Jesus and towards being a disciple. So Jesus stoops down and humbly washes the feet of his disciples, and Peter tries to stop him and says, "Lord, no, this is beneath you. You can't do this." And Jesus says, "In order to belong to me, I need to do this." So then Peter, in an exaggerated way, then says, "Okay, Lord, then wash my hands and my head as well." And what we see here is Peter, it may be exaggerated, but he is wanting to do everything he can to belong to Jesus and to follow Jesus well, and he's dedicated and passionate. In Matthew chapter 14, the disciples are out on the water and Jesus is walking on the water. And Peter sees him and he calls out to him and he says, "Jesus, tell me to come to you." And Peter steps out of the boat and he starts walking towards Jesus. And a few seconds later, or however long after, Peter starts to see the sea and the chaos around him, and he starts to sink. And when we hear this story, we often think of this as a highlight reel of Peter's failure, of Peter doubting, of Peter lacking faith. But if we looked at it differently, I think we'd see that Peter is stepping out. He is boldly walking towards Jesus on water. And we see a disciple who passionately wants to be close and follow his rabbi, who wants to be so close and near to Jesus. And so when he does start to sink and when he does start to fail or to doubt, Jesus is able to reach out and grab him immediately. We see that Jesus just wants to be close to him, or that Peter wants to be close to Jesus. Later in Matthew chapter 16, Peter reprimands Jesus for speaking about his impending death and what is to come. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And here we see Peter's humanity and his fear of what's to come for Jesus. Later in the garden, Peter is overconfident and he says, "Even if everyone denies you, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you, Lord." And quickly after that, Peter falls asleep when he's supposed to be keeping watch. And then when the men come and when the soldiers come to take Jesus away, Peter whips out his sword and cuts the ear off of a slave. And so we see him just again in his humanity and yes, overstepping and yes, failing and using violence. But we also just see Peter's passion and his zeal and his dedication to being a follower of Jesus. And there are other examples where Peter stumbles and blurts things out and is just acting in this zealous way. But rather than us focusing and just pinpointing all of Peter's failures, I want us to see him as a disciple who shows up, as a disciple who leans in. And even through his failure, he's trying and he's learning and he's growing. And it's only because of his failure that he's able to learn and grow. Brené Brown is a research professor and author, and in one of her books, Daring Greatly, she shares a quote from Roosevelt that I think perfectly emulates this idea of showing up. And I think it speaks to how we are to live as disciples of Jesus. And it reads, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man or woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcoming, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he or she fails, at least fails while daring greatly." And I love that quote, and I think that Peter, he gives us a masterclass of what it looks like to dare greatly. He shows up, and you could say that his face is marred by dust. And all of these things and all of these failures and all of these shortcomings, and what does Jesus say to Peter? He says, "You are the rock who I'm going to build my church on. I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom." And so Jesus redeems Peter's guilt and shame, and he looks at his vulnerability as a sign of strength, and he commissions Peter to build the church. And Peter just continues to show us what it looks like to be a disciple of Jesus, to be vulnerable, to show up, to lean in. And so I wonder, what does it look like for each of us to live vulnerably, to live as a disciple who's showing up and who's pressing in rather than pulling back, and a disciple who's willing to fail in order to learn and to lean into what Jesus is calling us to do? I know for myself, I've been encouraged to lean in, and I felt convicted to just have conversations around racial reconciliation. So this has been one area where I've just devoted myself to show up and to lean in. This year has been a sobering learning curve for me as I've wrestled with privilege and entrenched views, and I've just been confronted with my unawareness. And as I've leaned into these conversations, I have definitely failed and messed up at times. I feel like I can stumble over my words, or I can say the wrong thing, or I'm worried that I'm going to say something insensitive. Mixed with emotion and passion, there have been times where I've had horrible timing of when I brought these conversations up, or I've steamrolled people with information rather than trying to invite conversation. So I've felt my failure in this area. And yet, I just have this sense that God is continuing to call me to lean in, show up. And yes, you might make mistakes, but I think it's just for such a greater purpose than not trying to mess up or trying to play it safe. And I think I've felt called to just lean towards this desire for justice and to learn and to have conversations. So I wonder for you, as you think about Peter's example of what it looks like to be a disciple who's leaning in, and where do you feel currently like you are living in the arena, where you are daring greatly? Where do you feel like Jesus has invited you to show up and lean in? Or otherwise, where do you feel like maybe you're a spectator in your faith and that you've pulled back in order to play it safe and not wanting to fail? And where is God in calling you to just lean in and to try? Brené Brown also brilliantly expresses the experience of a disciple of Jesus when she says this in her book. She says, "And often the result of daring greatly isn't a victory march, as much as it is a quiet sense of freedom mixed with a little battle fatigue." I like that. So I say to you, let's follow Jesus together. Rather than leaning back and playing it safe, let's just embrace this battle fatigue as a sign that we're dedicated to fail trying.